This last week, last Monday, Sarah's folks popped over for a little while. Sarah's birthday was last Sunday, June 7th. And her parents drove over along with her aunt to celebrate Sarah's birthday with us. It was a real quick visit, but Monday night, I was talking to Sarah's mom, Lorraine. And in the midst of our conversation, Lorraine asked me what I was preaching right now here at Reunion. And I explained to her, I said, for the summer, I just thought kind of a simple and quiet and beautiful way to spend the summer together was to make our way through that collection of Psalms that's called the Psalms of Ascent, Psalms 120 through 134. Not all of them, but some select ones. And she was really intrigued by that, and so she asked me, what's the first one that you covered? Again, this was on Monday, so just yesterday, what'd you kickstart the series with? And I told her, I said, we spent some time looking at Psalm 121. And as soon as I mentioned that to Lorraine, she immediately teared up. I mean, just immediately. And it's one of those moments where this happens to me a lot in ministry where I'll mention some scripture or some idea, and I will realize this has meant a great deal to you. And so I waited because she started to say something to me. She was overcome by emotion, just kind of waited to let her kind of say what she needed to say. And she explained to me, I did not know this before, that when Sarah's brother Steve was dying of colon cancer, many of you know this, he died of colon cancer at the age of 32, that when Steve was dying of colon cancer, that Psalm 121, at least the first couple of verses of it, are what Steve would speak to himself again and again in the midst of his pain. Do you remember those first two verses we looked at them last week? I lift my eyes up to the mountains. Where does my help come from? My help comes from the Lord, the maker of heaven and earth. And Lorraine explained to me that there were moments, especially in the final days, when he would sometimes be collapsed on the bathroom floor, so sick from all the chemotherapy, but just in general, the cancer that was ravaging his body. And she said there were just moments where he would just say that, just out of the blue, just say, I lift my eyes up to the mountains. Where does my help come from? My help comes from the Lord, the maker of heaven and earth. And he would say it, speak it over himself again and again, and it would give him strength. I didn't know that. I thought that was a beautiful thing. And Lorraine went on to explain to me that there were many moments still, though, in the final days, once she kind of picked up on the fact that that was a psalm that Steve would speak to himself to give him courage. Because again, as we talked about last week, there are moments, remember, we find ourselves in, even if we're speaking metaphorically, mountains where we know there are enemies that are hidden away that can attack us, the enemy, the one who brings death and destruction into our lives. But Psalm 121 is that we have a great guard. We have the relentless protective presence of God in our lives. Steve would speak that over himself, and Lorraine learned that this was kind of his habit, but she said in the final days, there were many moments where he was so weak, and his voice had been reduced to such a whisper that the only thing he could get out was, where does my help come from? And I think it's mostly from a weakened state, but for all we know, and you would be in the same boat, I would be in the same boat. If my body's ravaged and I'm in constant pain and constant sickness, I'm having to leave this world so much earlier than I want to. I have a daughter that I want to raise, all these things that Steve was going through, that maybe there were moments where he's like, where does my help come from? And Lorraine said that in those moments where that's all he would say is, where does my help come from? That she wouldn't let him just stop there, but she would step in and she would say, Steve, your help comes from the Lord, the maker of heaven and earth. So sometimes she would grab a Bible and she would read the rest of the psalm to him, Psalm 121. He will not let your foot slip. He will be your shade at your right hand. He watches over your soul both now and forevermore. She would finish it for him. She would speak the truths over him, for him when he was too weak and maybe even sometimes just trembling in his faith. She would pick up the mantle and carry it for him. Well, at this point, I'm kind of getting overcome by emotions. We're sitting there at the table. And I looked at Lorraine and I said, everything about this is stunningly beautiful to me. And not just because of the truths that you and Steve were seeking to embrace together when you're pinned in a mountain and the enemy of death is trying to rob you of both body and soul, and you're embracing the truths of a great guard, a great God. But I told her what's so beautiful to me is that you both together in those moments were actually literally living out Psalm 121. You're actually living it, acting it out in real time, the way the psalm is supposed to unfold. I don't know if you have much appreciation at all for the approach that I've taken on the daily readings for this month, because what I decided to do for the summer months is you're going to read the same psalm, one of the Psalms of Ascent, every single day, the same one, again and again and again. Now, on social media, I've been presenting it to you in different translations to maybe keep it a little fresh, but as I insisted with you, is be patient with this, because you know what I think we do all the time in the church? We just want to learn, don't we? Just want to read, and not dwell with the Word of God. Really let it sink in. Now, I don't know if you noticed this last week and all the time that you spent in Psalm 121, but what I think is so powerful about this psalm is that in these first two voices, when you read it, or when I read it, when we first start in this psalm in verses 1 and 2, it is me talking to myself, isn't it? You read that psalm aloud, it's me talking to myself. You know, when you talk in terms of grammatical person or voice, it's first person. I lift my eyes up to the mountains. Where does my help come from? Well, my help comes from the Lord, the maker of heaven and earth. It's me speaking that over myself. But maybe this last week, as you read Psalm 121 over and over and over again, one of the things that stood out to you is that there is a radical shift after verse 2 and started in verse 3 from grammatical person. Because right after this, all of a sudden, you've got someone else that shoehorns their way into the conversation, don't they? Did you notice that when you read it? All of a sudden, grammatical person-wise, it's second person pronouns. Well, he will not let your foot slip. He who watches over you will not slumber. In fact, it's one of the things that's so moving to me about Psalm 121 is the last time I speak is in verse 2. Verses 3 through 8, it's not me speaking, it's you speaking to me. It's not me having to rest on my own strength and my own courage to speak the words over myself, but to realize that there is another voice, there is someone flanking me, if you will, on this journey of life who steps in the moments where I am too weak and where there's moments where my faith is trembling because of the terror of the mountains. And this person now goads me along toward belief. You know what I mean by goad? Sometimes we use it in terms of negativity, but to goad is to poke, it's to prod, it's to nudge, it's to push. It is to encourage someone towards something or someone. In this case, it's you goading me, you stepping in right after a moment where I speak to myself. You come up behind me and you say all of these other truths to goad me along in the moments where I'm too weakened to keep speaking them myself. It's a beautiful image to me, really, when I think about what this must have been like when the Israelites sang Psalm 121 on their way to Jerusalem. I think probably the way it unfolded was there was a leader of the congregation, the swarm of people who were traveling along the road. They would sing out verses 1 and 2, but from that point on, it is the whole community of Israel coming around the singer and singing verses 3 through 8. I love this shift from that whole first person to second person, that idea of someone flanking me, the idea of a goader. Goaders, it was not a word before today, but now I officially bless it and make it a word, goader. The people who step into our lives, fellow believers, who speak over us these wonderful truths of fellow believer to me. And I love this about the psalm because this is absolutely the way life has to unfold for us, isn't it? I mean, how many moments do you spend this this time in this world and you're wrestling with whether or not you hold these things to be true, all of a sudden you find yourselves in mountains, so to speak. And what happens when you feel the threat of an enemy or you're in the midst of the attack of the enemy? You know this is true about you, it's true about me. We become the most irrational, unrealistic people ever. We are so overcome by anxiety and fear and worry that we'll throw our hands up in the air and we will cry out along with the psalmist. And there's nothing wrong with this. We will cry out, where does my help come from? Or maybe to quote another psalm, there are moments where things seem so dark and so overwhelming that we pull from the words of David, the words that Jesus cried out when we say, my God, why have you forsaken me? There's moments like that. And we can hold all of these things to be true in better days, that there is a great guard who watches over us. But man, when you're in the midst of it, you're just like me. We become the most unrealistic, irrational people. And are there times, sometimes, where you can calm yourself down and I think speak over yourself the beauty of Psalm 121, verses 1 through 2? I lift my eyes up to the mountains. Where does my help come from? Brian, my help comes from the Lord, maker of heaven and earth. Sometimes I can settle, sometimes I can still my heart. But more often than not, I need another voice. I need a goader. I need someone to goad me. I need someone who will step into my life. Reunion, this is the living out of what we talked about last week. I need someone to come into my life in the moments where I'm crying out, where does my help come from? And I'm in a weakened state or my faith is trembling, that you step in and say, Brian, your help comes from the Lord, maker of heaven and earth. Don't forget, you have a great guard. Or maybe the goading goes even deeper than that. It's the moments where you have to step in, and when I cry out and say, I just don't see it. I don't see his protection. I don't see his protecting presence. You have to come along and goad me a little bit more firmly in which you say, Brian, look, really? Like nowhere in the last few days, you've not seen anything of the protective presence of God, nothing at all. Can we sit together for a moment and maybe explore that his protection has been here? It just doesn't look exactly the way you want it to be. Or maybe the goading even needs to go more firmly. The moment where I cry out, I just don't see this God you speak of, some great guard, and you goad a little bit more firmly. And you have to say to me, Brian, I'm not insisting that this is true. I am simply saying it's something that needs to be entertained. Remember, Rena, we talked about this last week. It's where you look at a brother or sister and say, is it possible? Again, not insisting this is the case, but is it possible God has offered you his protection and you've rejected it in your own arrogance? It's not a comfortable moment, but it's a beautiful goading moment. Or that deeper sense, we talked about this last week, Brian, is it possible that the absence of the one form of protection that you wanted so much, God is withholding because there's a greater protection he has in mind? Maybe we need to think through that together. Do you hear the goading? Because there's moments where we need another voice, isn't there? Last week I said the greatest traveling mercy of all the traveling mercies granted us by God is simply his presence, his protective presence. But this is the second greatest one. It's the goading presence of fellow believers. It's the nudging, pushing presence of voices in my life who push me deeper toward belief. It's beautiful. In Psalm 121, I can read it one way and I find myself thanking God that he is my great guard. I'm thanking God for his everlasting presence in my life. And yet I'll read Psalm 121 another time, and what I find myself thanking God for is your presence. Not just his presence, but your presence. I find myself reading Psalm 121 and not just thanking God, the great guard, but I find myself thanking God for goaders in life. It's beautiful, Psalm 121. Thank God for goaders, these godly voices. I read Psalm 121 from that different angle and spend some time with it, and I find myself thanking God for goaders, and really asking God for more of them in my life. But this too, I find myself asking God for more time with goaders in my life. More time with them. I don't know, I honestly do not know how much we are supposed to get out of or run with or play with the order of these psalms in this collection of the Psalms of Ascent, 120 through 134. But I do know that for hundreds of years it's been passed down to us in a particular order. This is Psalm 121 and then Psalm 122. And so I think we need to think about the order of this. I find this to be really powerful. That in Psalm 121, at the very end of it, I do indeed find myself thanking God that He is my great guard. I find myself thanking God for you, the presence of another voice, a goader in my life. I find myself with the lingering thought of, I need more goaders in my life. I find myself thinking, I need more time with goaders in my life. And that's the end of Psalm 121, which goes right into Psalm 122, verse 1. I rejoiced with those who said to me, let us go to the house of the Lord. Psalm 121, we're giving thanks for God, our great guard. Psalm 121, we're giving thanks to God for goaders in our life. Psalm 122, we're suddenly, and I think most appropriately, giving thanks to God for, yes, worship gatherings. I rejoiced with those who said to me, let us go to the house of the Lord. And why does the psalmist find himself rejoicing? When you look at the rest of the psalm and it unfolds for you, the psalmist is saying, it's because when we gather together, what happens is all of the tribes of Israel, the tribes of the Lord, they're coming together so that together they can praise the name of the Lord. It's the psalmist saying that I rejoice in this because there's something incredibly powerful for me in a world that is filled with mountains and enemies and the enemy, that I get to come together with a group of people that pull together then this swirl of songs and teachings of praise that are lifting up before me this truth that I have such a hard time holding on to, which is that there is a God and He guards us forevermore. That I get to hear these in the songs of the people. Regardless of issues of style, it's the power of a united voice lifting up these truths. And so I rejoice because it pushes me on. It goads me. It prods me. It nudges me into faith. The psalmist goes further and says, I rejoice because we get to stand before the thrones of judgment. We sit there and say, oh yeah, that's the reason I don't like to gather for worship, is the feeling of judgment. But we have to get beyond ourselves and how uncomfortable we feel because we all desire judgment. We desire a place where the collective people of God come together and wrestle through with great fear and trembling what is right in the eyes of God and what is wrong in the eyes of God. Because what's happening is all of us in the scattered nature of our lives during the week are crying out to God for justice. And when His people gather together, they acknowledge that there is one who is just above all others, and He is doling out justice day in and day out. And so I rejoice in the swirl of the teachings and the prayers because they speak of justice and the beauty of judgment that is putting a world right. Why does he rejoice? I think I'm probably even getting ahead of myself because the psalmist, I don't think, is just rejoicing for songs and teachings. I think it's much more general than that. I mean, look at how the whole thing starts. It says, I rejoice when they said to me that it's time for us to come together for worship. Because in that moment, our feet will be standing in your gates, Jerusalem. And Jerusalem is built like a city that is closely compacted together. Now, stretch beyond the hard imagery of a city and gates and recognize that what the psalmist is getting at is simply this. I rejoice because it just feels so good to see that I'm not alone. It feels so good to watch a scattered people coming together and standing together as one. That when the people come together, I can say again that it is not just I who believe, but you believe, and you believe, and you believe. And it's built on a foundation. It's being built up by a city, and we stand in its gates because it has not fallen. This is truth. And this is reality. And it pushes me on to faith. And so the psalmist says, I rejoiced when they said that I get to do these things. Because what the psalmist is saying more than anything, when you really dig into Psalm 122, it's just a continuation of Psalm 121. Really, that invitation, let us go to the house of the Lord, is let's gather and goad one another along in this terrifying, painful world. That's what the writer of Hebrews says later on in chapter 10, verse 25, let us not give up meeting together, but to spur, to goad one another along. It's beautiful to gather because it's where the goading happens. I rejoice with those who said to me, let's have a church service. If I climb in a time machine, I went back a number of years, I would have cringed at the Brian Lowry who would have made that kind of translation of this. But I don't anymore, because here's what I have to acknowledge to you. These Psalms in my life have been so intensely personal. And in particular, Psalms 121 and 122 have been intensely personal for me because for about 10 years now, they are the reason that have continued to goad me out of bed on a Sunday morning and to recognize the importance of a gathering. That if I'm honest, it's interesting for me that over time, Psalms 121 and 122 taken together are the reason why I am radically committing myself for the rest of my life to getting to the gathering. And I mean the gathering. Can stuff happen around a kitchen table? Yeah, and that can be church and that can be beautiful. But I'm talking about stretching yourself to get together with the people you don't know all that well, and it's awkward because you're all trying to figure out. I'm talking about the gathering, the large gathering. I'm talking about Jerusalem coming together from the four corners of the world. That happens on a Sunday morning. I don't know how many times I get asked the question, why? Why attend a church service? And not only that, I get asked this question, why attend a church service, a worship gathering regularly? Not just every once in a while, I mean the discipline of every Sunday. Why? And let me just say this, that is a perfectly good question. Absolutely nothing wrong with anyone answering the question. Because honestly, if we just take it to the base level, ain't nobody getting saved because they're going to a church service every Sunday, okay? When I was a kid, they would hand out all the little perfect pins for perfect attendance in Sunday school and all that. I'm kind of glad the church has gotten rid of that. This is not about perfect attendance, okay? Because it's not a salvation issue on whether or not you show up every single Sunday. I'm not saying that. There's some reasons you can't make it, vacations, work. I get all of that. I'm not a moron. I'm not a jerk. But still the question, why? So it's a perfectly good question. Why should I come to a worship service, not just every once in a while, but regularly? And it's a good question because I think if we're all frank, sleeping in feels real good, doesn't it? And I think if we're all honest, letting the kids be in the soccer league they want to be in feels real good because the kids are happy. And I think more along the lines today is as much as some people say the whole happy wife, happy life, I think sometimes it's kind of tipped the scales to happy child, things are going to be meek and mild, man. Now, I still think it's happy wife, happy life, just to be clear. Why? The best way I know forward in this, and I'll start here and I want to come back to the psalm, is I think you need to come for God and because he told you to. I don't want to ignore that. You remember in when I say come for God, you remember in Psalm 121, this is one of the beautiful things about it, is that God says, God says through the psalmist that I never sleep and I never slumber. It's God's declaration through the psalmist in which he says, there is never a moment that I slumber in my wanting to provide for you. You know what he's saying is that means every hour of every day, 7 days a week. Can I say something really frank here? I kind of feel like we can give an hour or so for him on a Sunday. Every hour of every day, of every week, of every month, of every year, he does not sleep or slumber. He is saying yes to you and your family. I think you and I can say no to some things for him. How about you? I think we can get our rears out of bed. How about you? And it could mean you're real tired. And it could mean I'm real tired. And it could mean your kids are ticked. But you know what I'd tell yourself? You're being an even better parent than you thought before. For God. And also because he told us to. See, sometimes we think that the kind of gathering is just something we could shrug off as optional. You do realize it's a commandment. It's actually radical disobedience for saying, I don't need that. My kids don't need that. So I start there, just so everyone's mad at me. Come for God and because he told you to, but how about this? Come for the goaders. Come for the goading. Man, all week long, you're out in the mountains. All week long, your kids are out in the mountains. All week long, the things that you hold as truth, you hear the voices that say to you, you really believe that still? You mean to tell me? All week long, you're being told that the stuff that you believe is so out of date. You're on the wrong side of history. All week long, you hear that garbage. All week long. And what happens for us is I think when we gather together in a worship gathering, the journey we make to this place in this hour is like the journey that Israel made to Jerusalem, where one of us are coming together all isolated and swarming with these voices that have been breaking us down. And we cry out as one single small fractured frail voice. I have been lifting my eyes up to the mountains. Where does my help come from? And like Israel of old, all of a sudden, outside of that one single voice, you hear the voices of your brothers and sisters who say, your help comes from the Lord, maker of heaven and earth, and he will not let your foot slip. He is your shade at your right hand, and he is watching over your soul now and forever. Does it come in a song? Maybe. Does it come in a conversation? Maybe. Does it come in a prayer? Maybe. Does it come in the sermon? Probably not, but maybe. Does it maybe just simply come, doggone it, that you're getting together with others and you realize I'm not alone, but you believe, and you believe, and look, I see you again, you believe. That when we stand in the gates of what God has built and we can say this is a city tightly compacted, woven together, and it stands. Come for the goading. I'm not talking just for you. I'm talking for your kids and I'm talking for your grandkids. Come for the goading. Come. Let us speak the beauty of these truths over each other. Because here's what I would say. I'm not saying perfect worship attendance is going to save you. But what's been powerful to me is I don't know how many Sundays I have been saved by being with you. Because you have made sure that this guy right here who's prone to wonder has not wondered, because you are goading me even by me hearing your voice, even if you can't sing in tune. So come for God, come for the Goaders. And who said this was all about you anyway? Come to goad. Here's something that's really huge for me that I've had to get over in my life. And that's it. I told you before there was a stretch where Sarah and I, we didn't really even feel how seriously do we want to take having to show up every single Sunday? And what I felt radically confronted by God about in that moment is that this is something that if I'm not careful, this is what I do, is I will wake up on a Sunday morning and I will sometimes want to gauge whether or not I need the services that a worship service offers me. And there's a lot of Sundays that I could wake up and I think to myself, I'm good. No mountains in my life. Things are pretty good. Things are good for Sarah. Things are good for Eden. I'm pretty good. I really don't need church today. And what I have to train myself to think more and more, even the older I get, is that even if I could be saying that somewhere, that somewhere across town, there's someone who's waking up, and they're probably not saying this way. If they are, that's beautiful, but in no less terms, someone across town is waking up and they're saying, I rejoice that they are saying to me that today we will gather for worship because I need this. I need so-and-so. I need to see so-and-so. I need to see this. I need to hear this. I need to fall in love again. I need to believe again. So that's happening all the way across town when I'm waking up on a Sunday and saying, I think I'm good. What if my call on that day is this? Hey, Brian, why don't you be the second voice in Psalm 121? Why don't you be the guy who gets out of bed? Why don't you be the guy who says no to this or that so you can come because someone is sitting there somewhere and say, I am not good today. Your Father's Day coming up next Sunday has me thinking about my dad, and one of the things that stood out to me just a couple of years ago was I found myself thinking to myself, here's my dad who is one of the most respected New Testament minds in the Christian church circles and really even beyond. I mean, he's taught internationally. Honestly, and I know I'm biased on this, but my dad was a genius about New Testament and about church and about this, that, and the other. I mean, just a genius about it. And yet one of the things that I found so fascinating about Dad, and I'd never really stopped to think about it, is the dude went to church services every single Sunday. And if there has ever been someone in my life, ever, that I thought to myself, you're probably good today if you want to lay low, it was my dad. There's so many times that I thought to myself, I'm sitting in a pew and I can look down and I'm like, is he getting anything out of this sermon? Because he could probably stand up and preach this without even studying the passage. But there he was every Sunday. And man, I knew there were Sundays he was tired. And I knew there were Sundays too where he was sick and tired of the church. You do conflict management for churches. There's a lot of times where you're like, you know what, I'm good to stay away from her for a while. But there he was every single Sunday. And what hit me on that is I absolutely think my dad was goaded along in that. I do. I think he did get something out of it. But the memories I have of my dad on that Sunday morning is not necessarily any image of him being blown away by a sermon, or in particular him liking the style of music. The memories I have of my dad is off to the side with a dude named Bill Farwell who had questions about Revelation every single week, and my dad is sketching stuff out on the back of a offering envelope to help him understand it. It's Dad off to the side. I remember whispering a prayer over Betty Killebrew when she was dying of cancer. It's my dad who is going up and congratulating some kid who just dedicated his life to full-time ministry. It was my dad going to goad, if anything else. It was a big eye-opener for me to realize, I kind of think to myself, if that's something that my dad ought to be involved in, that maybe I should be too. It's not all about us anyway. Even if on the morning you're not the one who's crying out for help in the midst of the mountains, then maybe you're the second voice, man. And if you're not here, there is no second voice. And you have got a brother or sister who leaves just asking, where does my help come from? It's the goading. It's the second greatest traveling mercy that we've got. And all I know is that in the midst of the busyness, we don't have a lot of time together. And if at the end of Psalm 121, you're like me and you're saying, thank God for the goaders, I need more of them and I need more time with them, then keep walking right into Psalm 122. So I will rejoice when they say to me, it's time to gather. Because it's time to goad. Me to goad you, you to goad me.